In a small fishing village near the coast of Nigeria, there lived a man named Adabo. He was known in the village as a skilled fisherman and a loving father to his young daughter, Ada. Every morning, Adabo would wake up early, kiss his sleeping daughter's forehead, and head out to sea in his small wooden boat. Ada was the light of Adabo's life. Her mother had died when she was just a baby, so it was always just the two of them. Adabo taught Ada everything he knew about fishing and the sea. She loved to sit on the beach and wait for her father to return, waving excitedly when she saw his boat on the horizon. One day, when Ada was 7 years old, she begged her father to take her fishing with him. Adabo was hesitant, but Ada's big brown eyes and eager smile won him over. "Okay, my little fish," he said, "but you must promise to be very careful and do exactly as I say." Ada nodded eagerly, and the next morning they set out together. The sea was calm and the sun shone brightly. Adabo showed Ada how to cast the nets and pull them in. She laughed with joy when they caught their first fish. But as the day wore on, the weather began to change. Dark clouds rolled in and the wind picked up. Adabo knew they needed to head back to shore. As he turned the boat around, a large wave crashed over them. Adabo held onto the boat tightly, but when he looked up, Ada was gone. "Ada!" he screamed, scanning the choppy waters. He dove in again and again, searching desperately for his daughter. But the sea was too rough, and Ada was nowhere to be found. For days, Adabo searched. The whole village helped, combing the beaches and sending out search parties, but Ada never appeared. Weeks turned into months, and still, Adabo couldn't accept that his daughter was gone. He stopped fishing and spent his days walking along the shore, looking out at the sea that had taken his child. The other villagers tried to comfort him, but Adabo pushed them away. His grief was like a heavy stone in his chest, weighing him down with every step. One night, as Adabo sat on the beach, an old woman from the village approached him. Her name was Mama E, and she was known for her knowledge of old stories and legends. "Adabo," she said softly, "I know your pain is great, but you must find a way to live again." Adabo shook his head. "How can I live without my Ada?" Mama E sat down beside him. "Let me tell you a story," she said. "A story about the people who live beneath the waves." And so, Mama E began to tell Adabo about the M people. She spoke of beautiful creatures, half human and half fish, who lived in grand underwater cities. They could breathe both air and water, and they were said to have great magic. Some say, Mama E whispered, that the M people can bring back those lost to the sea. Adabo's eyes widened. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. "Is this true, Mama E? Can they bring back my Ada?" The old woman's face grew serious. "These are just stories, Adabo. We cannot know if they are true. And even if they are, the M people are not to be trifled with. They are powerful and dangerous." But Adabo wasn't listening anymore. His mind was racing with possibilities. If the M people were real, if they could bring back his daughter, he had to find them. From that day on, Adabo's obsession grew. He spent all his time researching M people legends, questioning travelers about any strange sightings in the sea, and watching the waves for any sign of these magical creatures. The villagers began to worry about Adabo. They whispered that grief had driven him mad, but Adabo didn't care what they thought. He knew that somewhere out there, beneath the waves, was the key to bringing his daughter back. Months passed, and Adabo's search continued. He neglected his work, his home, and himself. His once strong body grew thin, and his eyes took on a wild, desperate look. Then one stormy night, everything changed. Adabo was walking along the beach, as he did every night, when he heard a strange sound. It was like singing, but more beautiful than any human voice he had ever heard. Adabo followed the sound, stumbling over rocks and through the crashing waves. There, in a small tidal pool hidden among the rocks, he saw her, a small figure, no, bigger than Ada had been, with pale green skin and long flowing hair. But where legs should have been, there was a shimmering fishtail. Adabo's heart pounded. A mermaid child, the answer to all his prayers. Without thinking, he lunged forward and grabbed the child. She thrashed in his arms, her tail slapping against his legs, but Adabo held on tight. "You'll bring her back," he muttered, his eyes wild. "You'll bring my Ada back." As he carried the mermaid child away from the sea, her cries echoed through the night. But Adabo didn't hear them. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the whisper of hope that, at last, he would see his daughter again. Tabo carried the mermaid child to his small hut on the outskirts of the village. He had long ago boarded up the windows and kept the door locked, hiding from the concerned and pitying looks of his neighbors. Now, this secrecy would serve a new purpose. Inside, he placed the mermaid child in a large wooden tub filled with seawater. The child thrashed and wailed, her cries unlike anything Adabo had ever heard, part human, part dolphin, all anguish. But Adabo's mind was too focused on his goal to feel sympathy. "Now," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, "you will bring back my Ada." The mermaid child looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I don't understand," she said, her voice bubbling like water over rocks. "Who are you? Where am I? I want to go home." Adabo blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected the creature to speak his language. "You're here to help me," he said. "My daughter Ada was taken by the sea. You're going to bring her back." The mermaid child shook her head, her long seaweed-like hair swaying. "I can't do that. I don't have that kind of power. Please let me go back to my family." But Adabo wouldn't listen. He was convinced that this magical creature was the key to reuniting with Ada. He spent the next days trying to persuade, then threaten, then beg the mermaid child to use her magic. The mermaid child, who told Adabo her name was Coral, tried to explain that she was just a child with no more power to raise the dead than a human child would have. But Adabo's grief-stricken mind couldn't accept this. Days turned into weeks. Adabo kept Coral in the tub, changing her water daily with fresh seawater he collected at night. He brought her fish to eat, but she often refused, too sad and frightened to have an appetite. As time passed, Adabo began to talk to Coral more. At first it was just about Ada, how beautiful she was, how much he missed her. But gradually, he found himself telling Coral about his life as a fisherman, about the village, about the stories his own father used to tell him. Coral, in turn, began to share stories of her own. She told Adabo about the underwater city where she lived, about her own family, her mother, father, and 2 brothers. She described the colorful fish that were her friends, the songs her people sang, and the games they played in the coral reefs. Despite himself, Adabo found himself becoming fascinated by Coral's tales. He had always loved the sea, and hearing about the wonders beneath the waves stirred something in him that had been dormant since Ada's death. One day, as Coral was describing a particularly beautiful underwater garden, Adabo found himself smiling. It was a small, rusty thing, this smile, but it was the first time his lips had curved upward in over a year. Coral noticed. "You have a nice smile," she said. "You should do it more often." Adabo's smile faded as quickly as it had come. "I haven't had much reason to smile," he said gruffly. Coral looked at him with her large, pearlescent eyes. "I'm sorry about your daughter," she said softly. "In my city we have a saying, the sea gives and the sea takes away, but love flows eternal like the tides." Adabo felt a lump in his throat. "What does that mean?" he asked. It means that even though the sea might take someone we love, the love we feel for them never goes away. It's always there, like the tides, coming and going but never truly leaving. Adabo sat in silence for a long time after that, thinking about Coral's words. For the first time since Ada's death, he allowed himself to really feel the love he had for his daughter, not just the pain of losing her. As the weeks turned into months, a slow change began to take place in Adabo. He started taking better care of himself, washing and eating regularly. He began to talk to Coral, not as a magical solution to his problems, but as a person, or at least a sentient being with thoughts and feelings of her own. Coral, too, began to see Adabo differently. She still missed her home and family terribly, but she no longer saw Adabo as a monster who had kidnapped her. She saw a broken man, misguided by grief, who was slowly beginning to heal. One night, as a storm raged outside, Adabo sat by Coral's tub, listening to the wind. "How I've been a fool," he said suddenly. Coral, who had been humming softly to herself, stopped and looked at him. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I thought I could force the sea to give me back what it had taken," Adabo said. "I thought I could use you to undo what had been done. But that's not how the world works, is it?" Coral shook her head. "No," she said gently. "It's not." Adabo sighed heavily. "I've done you a great wrong, Coral. I took you from your home, from your family. I've kept you prisoner here, all because I couldn't face my own loss." Tears began to roll down his cheeks. For the first time since Ada's death, Adabo allowed himself to really cry. All the grief, the anger, the guilt he had been holding on to came pouring out. Coral reached out a webbed hand and placed it on Adabo's arm. "It's okay," she said. "You were hurting. Sometimes when we're in pain, we do things we wouldn't normally do." Adabo looked at her, his vision blurry with tears. "How can you forgive me so easily?" Coral smiled. "Because I've seen the good in you, Adabo. You're not a bad person. You're someone who lost his way for a while, but now you're finding it again." As the storm continued to rage outside, Adabo made a decision. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm taking you back to the sea." Coral's eyes widened. "Really?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. Adabo nodded. "It's time for you to go home, and it's time for me to let go." That night, as Coral slept, Adabo stayed awake, thinking about everything that had happened. He thought about Ada, about the day he lost her, about the grief that had consumed him. But for the first time, he also allowed himself to think about the happy times. Ada's laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she saw him, the feel of her small hand in his. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, Adabo felt something shift inside him. The heavy stone of grief in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter somehow, as if he could finally breathe around it. He looked over at Coral, peaceful in her sleep, and knew that it was time for both of them to return to where they belonged. As the sun rose, Adabo gently woke Coral. "It's time," he said softly. Coral's eyes lit up with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Adabo carefully lifted her from the tub and wrapped her in a damp blanket to keep her skin moist. They left the hut in the early morning light, when the village was still quiet. Adabo carried Coral down to the beach, his heart heavy but determined. As they reached the water's edge, he paused. "Coral," he said, "I want to thank you. You've taught me more than you know." Coral smiled up at him. "And you've taught me too, Adabo. I've learned that even humans can change their hearts." Adabo waded into the water, feeling the familiar pull of the waves around his legs. When he was waist deep, he gently lowered Coral into the sea. She slipped from the blanket with ease, her tail flashing in the morning sun. "Will you be okay?" Adabo asked, suddenly worried about the young mermaid making her way home alone. Coral nodded. "The sea is my home. I'll find my way." This touching tale of Adabo and Coral teaches us valuable lessons about grief, healing, and the power of compassion. It shows how consuming grief can be, leading us to make misguided choices, but also demonstrates that it's never too late to change, course, and make amends. The story reminds us that while we can't change the past, we can choose how we move forward, and that sometimes letting go is the bravest thing we can do. Key lessons. Grief can be overwhelming, but it shouldn't define us forever. Compassion and understanding can come from unexpected places. It's important to face our emotions rather than seeking impossible solutions. Healing is a journey, and it often involves helping others along the way, just as Adabo found a way to honor Ada's memory while moving forward. We too can find strength in our struggles and grow from our experiences. If you enjoyed this story and its lessons, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring content that encourages reflection and personal growth.